Hannah and her wonderful example. You might remember, brothers and sisters and young people, that we left Hannah in our last study reassured, don't you think, by the providential wisdom of God, who had so wonderfully provided for the safekeeping of her son at the sanctuary. That Jephthah's daughter had not only inspired Hannah to dedicate her child to that spirit of perpetual service, but that woman's presence at the temple provided the guardian care that Samuel so desperately needed in that place. It reminds us, does it not, that the ways of God are inscrutable, and that Hannah was brought to the realization that God's timing was always perfect and had been so from the very beginning. And it's a reminder to us all, when in doubt and when under stress, to recognize that same truth in our own lives, that God's timing is perfect. Well, that brings us to this last section of the 1st of Samuel chapter 2. And these two chapters, as we've seen, have chronicled the life of one of the greatest women who ever lived in Israel. And the fact that this story about the man of God that starts in verse 27, the fact that this record comes at the end of Hannah's story, I don't think came about by chance. I think there's deliberate intent here by the Spirit in its placement in the narrative. In fact, what I'm going to suggest to you is that the proper perspective of the message of the man of God was that it represented in certain respects the culmination of Hannah's work and of Hannah's purpose. So when we read this message, which incidentally we're not going to spend a lot of time on this morning because there's just too much to cover, but when we do think about the message of the man of God and we read it with Hannah in view, we will see that it represents God's endorsement of his handmaid, who always served her master's cause. So see what it says, 1st of Samuel 2, verse 27. And there came a man of God unto Eli, and said unto him, Thus saith Yahweh, did I plainly appear unto the house of thy father when they were in Egypt in Pharaoh's house? And did I choose him out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to offer upon mine altar, to burn incense, to wear an ephod? And did I give unto the house of thy father all the offerings made by fire of the children of Israel? And of course, the answer to all those questions was yes, God did, God had. As the man of God now proceeded to explain the basis and the origin of the Aaronic order of priesthood. But you see, there's something strange when you think about it, about the message of this man of God. He came from parts unknown, and when his message was delivered, he disappeared without trace. His appearance to Eli was to judge the iniquity of Eli's household. But when Hannah heard about this message, as I think she did, it told her that she was not alone, that there were others who shared her love for the truth, that there were others who were part of the faithful remnant in Israel. And that detail would not be lost on Hannah when she heard about this message of the man of God. But here's the question. How would Hannah have ever heard this message? And who from? Because it's very clear, and Eli was probably very thankful it came in private because it was so terrible in its warning upon his household. The man of God came to Eli. They spoke in private. The only person that even knew about this message was Eli. But with that came the awful burden of living in silence with the knowledge now of the judgment that was about to fall upon his household. Eli knew, but nobody else did. Every day the old man knew that to be awake was to be aware, and he couldn't tell a soul. He certainly couldn't tell his sons, could he? He couldn't tell Hophni and Phinehas about the message of the man of God because they would have been as scornful and defiant as ever. They'd revile both the message and the messenger. So Eli was unable to share it with anyone. And that must have left the old man in the pit of despair. Oh, he wanted to speak to someone about it, but who? He only had the lad. But he was surely too young to be involved in such a terrible matter as this message. So Eli carried the burden alone. and he aged further under its strain. But then something happened which altered everything. A circumstance which arose because God shared the same information as the message of the man of God directly with Samuel himself. Now, we know about this, but let's just have a look at it in 1 Samuel chapter 3 and reading from verse 11. Yahweh said to Samuel, "Behold, I will do a thing in Israel at which both the ears of everyone that heareth it shall tingle, and in that day I will perform against Eli all the things which I have spoken concerning his house. When I begin, I will also make an end. For I have told him that I will judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knoweth, because his sons made themselves vile, and he restrained them not. And therefore I have sworn unto the house of Eli, that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be purged with sacrifice nor offering forever." And we know that in the morning, verse 16, Eli called Samuel and said, "Samuel, my son." And he answered, "Here am I." And he said, "What is the thing that Yahweh hath said unto thee? I pray thee, hide it not from me. God do so to thee, and more also, if thou hide anything from me of all the things that he said unto thee." And Samuel told him every whit, and hid nothing from him. And Eli said, "It is Yahweh. Let him do what seemeth him good." And you see, on that morning, when little Samuel came and shared that message, Eli not only knew that Samuel was aware now of God's judgment on his family, but that God had chosen Samuel as the instrument through whom his work would continue. And if that was the truth, if Samuel already knew, then there was no point in hiding from him the words of the man of God. And I think this was the moment that Eli had been waiting for. Now was the time for him to share the message of the man of God with Samuel. This is how it's going to turn up in the divine record, brothers and sisters, in a thoroughly private speech to a man alone. But it's in the divine record for us all to know. When and how did that get shared? I think this was the moment. I think this was the moment when Eli now shared the message with Samuel and urged him to guard the truth which his own family had disgraced. "Don't you lose it, my boy," he said to the little lad. And who do you think Samuel might share this with? Well, he'd always spoken with his mother. Every time she came up on her yearly visits, all his life, she'd guided him towards his priestly role. And he knew that these messages would be of compelling interest to her, not just the message of the man of God, which Eli had now told him about, but the message of the angel who'd spoken with him in person about the same things. And when Hannah heard that, she must have been absolutely astonished. So what did the man of God speak to Eli about? Well, in summary, he mentioned the high privilege that the house of Aaron enjoyed in their exercise of the priesthood, but that with that high privilege had come high responsibility. And God's judgment against Eli and his sons was very much on the basis that they sought the privilege, but they ignored the responsibility. In fact, Yahweh's principle, the basis by which he would operate and the basis by which he would judge people, was to be found in a little proverb hidden at the end of verse 30. This was Yahweh's operating principle, as it were. He said, "Be it far from me, for them that honour me I will honour, and they that despise me shall be lightly esteemed." Now you see, under that standard, the house of Eli was to be cut off. And there was an obvious and immediate application of that proverb to Hophni and Phinehas. They had despised God in their actions, and in turn they would be lightly esteemed by him. But don't you think that there was just as immediate an outworking of the proverb with Hannah? "Those that honour me, I will honour." Who should have received more honour than Hannah in the outworking of the story? Even though she sought no honour for herself, she was honoured when God enabled her to bear Samuel in response to her prayer. She was honored when God exalted her son by raising him to the leadership of the nation. She was honored when God chose her as his instrument to begin the next great stage of his purpose with his people. You see, everything that the man of God spoke in judgment against Eli was a corresponding endorsement of Hannah. And that's partly the significance, I think, of this message of the man of God. Now, time doesn't permit us to examine all his words, but let's come to the end of the story, the message of judgment, and take up the record from the 1st of Samuel, chapter 2 and verse 34, where, having just talked about the cutting off of the house of Eli, he says this, verse 34, "And this shall be a sign unto thee, O Eli, that shall come upon thy 2 sons, on Hophni and Phinehas. In one day they shall die, both of them. This shall be a sign unto thee," he says. So you see, if Eli thought that these judgments might lie far off in the future, well, if he thought that, then he was told how close they really were. It was one of the most terrible signs for a father to ever receive, that Hophni and Phinehas were to be struck down together on the same day in a sudden and violent death, and that he, Eli, would witness it in his lifetime. And that event, the death of his 2 sons, was going to be the pledge that everything the man of God uttered against his house would come to pass. Nothing would be left undone of all that the man of God had spoken. And just as Hophni and Phinehas were to be removed, verse 34, so now, verse 35, they were to be replaced. And verse 35 says, "And I will raise me up a faithful priest that shall do according to all that is in mine heart and my mind." So you see, with the death of Hophni and Phinehas, God set in motion a cascade of events that would remove the house of Ithamar and restore the house of Eleazar. But during the interregnum, God provided Israel with a faithful priest that would restore their confidence in the office of the priesthood. And that priest would be none other than Samuel, Hannah's son. He'd already proved himself worthy of the office. Do you notice what it says in chapter 3 and verse 20? It says, "All Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was established to be a prophet of Yahweh." But some of you will know that that word established, or man, is the same word translated a faithful priest in chapter 1, verse 35, in the message of the man of God. Samuel was that faithful one, because he would do everything that Hophni and Phinehas didn't do and wouldn't do. He was faithful to offer sacrifice, the priestly work of expiation. He was faithful to burn incense, the priestly work of intercession. He was faithful to wear an ephod, the priestly work of communication. In fact, Samuel was a priest all his life as the spiritual guide of the nation. Do you know that in all of Israel's subsequent history, really, Samuel was the one person who ever approached the high rank of Moses? Because like Moses, he was both the civil leader and the spiritual mediator. And in Samuel, the kingly and priestly roles would again be combined, and the spirit of the order of Melchizedek would be seen. But that was something that Hannah already knew about, didn't she? Because she'd alluded to that in her song. She understood that higher priesthood. And of that faithful priest, who shall do according to all that's in mine heart and in my mind, said the message of the man of God in verse 35, he says, "And I will build him a sure house, and he shall walk before mine anointed forever." Now, what an amazing promise. And what could that sure house be other than a future family of priests? Since Samuel was promised here that he would execute the priestly office in the presence of the anointed of Yahweh forever. So Samuel was a prototype of the company of priests who would all take their example from him. Because like him, their right to service would not be based on Aaronic authority, but some higher priestly line. related to the order of Melchizedek, and it was seen in type here in Samuel, whose own priesthood stood more related to his Nazirite vow than to his Levitical descent. Now, can you imagine how astonished Hannah must have been to hear these words? Because what she was being told when this message was delivered to her was that her son was to have the special honor of fulfilling priestly duties before Christ in the kingdom. It was enough to make her heart burst with joy. It was the ultimate accolade of heaven bestowed upon his handmaid in recognition of one whose mind was always focused on higher things. And verse 36 says, "It shall come to pass that everyone that is left in thine house, O Eli, shall come and crouch to him, Samuel, the faithful priest of verse 35, for a piece of silver and a morsel of bread, and shall say, Put me, I pray thee, I beseech thee, I beg of thee, into one of the priest's offices, that I may eat a piece of bread." So whatever future role Samuel was to have in the kingdom, what was certain was that his elevation was going to have immediate repercussions for the house of Eli. You see, the house of Eli was centered around the tabernacle operation at Shiloh. But when Shiloh was destroyed by the Philistines, the whole system of tabernacle worship was disrupted. It was overthrown. And the survivors were to be brought so low by the removal of the tabernacle that they were going to be reduced to penury. And who might they be? Well, the very members of Eli's family of Ithamar, they were the ones who were clustered around the sanctuary at Shiloh. And when it was overthrown, they became the chief sufferers in its overthrow. And what this verse tells us, 1 Samuel 2:36, is that their humble request to Samuel would be for some menial task in the priesthood in return for a subsistence living. To have to come and preach, to have to come and crouch before him and to plead for so little was a retribution, perhaps a righteous retribution on a family who had acted so imperiously towards others. So these words were a direct condemnation of Hophni and Phinehas, who had, of course, abused the priesthood to enrich themselves. And Hannah's song had spoken, do you remember, of those who, though full, would be so humble as to hire themselves out for bread. And now came the stunning endorsement of her prayer by the words of the man of God. And because they would come before Samuel to beg for bread, Hannah was being told that her son would determine the very future of Eli's house. Their survival would depend on his mercy and his provision. Now, when Hannah heard about the message of the man of God, well, she must have just been filled with amazement. But I think she was also humbled by the thought that she had set all this in motion. She, a woman, without importance, without rank, without influence. You see, in all our endeavors, brothers and sisters, we need to remember that we can only ever be but an instrument for Yahweh. And it's his prerogative to decide who his instrument might be. But this story, the story of the 1st of Samuel, chapters 1 and 2, it's how Yahweh responded to one who pleaded that she might be used for the accomplishment of his purpose. You see, here's the interesting thing, is that during the darkness of her trial, not once had she asked for her own sake or for her own satisfaction. Her desire was always for a priest who would do God's will. And this startling message from the man of God showed that her cries of despair, well, they'd been acknowledged. In the message of the man of God, it was as if God said in this message, Hannah, I have heard you. All you have grieved over will be removed. All you have sought for will be performed. All you have hoped for will be fulfilled. Hannah mourned over the peace offerings and Hophni and Phinehas' brazen disregard of them. And God's answer condemned Eli's sons in that very sin and promised that no sacrifice or offering would ever be efficacious on their behalf. And in that judgment, Hannah's spiritual grief was vindicated. Hannah yearned for a better priest to lead the nation in true worship, that she might bear such a child whom she would pledge, if he came, for lifetime service. And God's answer promised to raise that very priest in the person of her son. And in that promise, Hannah's godly desire was approved. Hannah felt the enmity between the seeds from the first time she met Eli's sons, and her song saw ahead to God's defeat of his enemies by sudden and violent overthrow. And God's answer showed his determined to execute that very penalty upon Hophni and Phinehas. And in that verdict, Hannah's divine perspective was endorsed. Hannah saw Hophni and Phinehas enriching themselves by the misuse of priestly privileges, but she believed in God's power to turn their fullness into poverty. And God's answer brought that very poverty upon Eli's family, using the words of Hannah herself to condemn them. And in that sentence, Hannah's righteous request was fulfilled. Don't you think the message of the man of God was an endorsement of Hannah? So how appropriate then for Hannah to hear about the message of the man of God, and probably, we suggest, from Samuel, her son. After all, who better to tell her? And far from being dissatisfied that God had not spoken with her directly, I think she must have been thrilled to hear that story from Samuel himself. Because, you see, it told her that God had already begun to use him as the channel of his communication. She felt that surge of fierce joy in her heart that she'd felt when she first gave the boy. God had answered her, and even now he was preparing that succession of events that would sweep away the household of Eli from the priesthood. And Samuel no doubt told his mother every whit of the man's words to Eli, and every whit of the angel's words to himself. He was probably still too young to understand all the meaning of the message. And he probably didn't really comprehend the terribleness of what it prophesied. But Hannah did. She deserved to hear this message as much as Eli. It was a message for her. Because in all that the man of God said, his words were both the condemnation of Hophni and Phinehas and the vindication of Hannah. You see, it was her spirit of faith that had enabled her to see beyond herself to the viewpoint of heaven. And the voice of the man of God was heaven's reply. And in heaven's answer, she was comforted. Because whatever might happen now, and however it might unfold, I think Hannah was content to rest in what she now knew. Nothing else mattered. The hand of God was at work in the affair, and she was content to leave it so. And with the ending of that message in the 1st of Samuel, chapter 2, the curtain fell on the final act in Hannah's life. Well, brothers and sisters, more than a millennia would pass. 1,000 years. You know, after 1,000 years, there's not much left of the history or heritage of a person. But 1,000 years were but as yesterday when the gospel record began, because at its opening, a woman would appear in whom the spirit of Hannah was seen. It was as if time stood still, because the account of Christ's birth and childhood was written in such a way that we might see in Mary another Hannah, and in Christ another Samuel. And there was nothing accidental about that likeness, for it was written up that way by the Spirit in the Gospels. But the question was why? Why was the story of Hannah and her son to be found in the Gospels at all? And even more puzzling was the fact that actually only one gospel would paint this picture. So why would that gospel and that gospel alone bring together every person involved in the drama of Hannah and her son's early life by presenting an exact counterpart of those people in the story of Mary and her firstborn son. Why would a gospel writer do that? Well, the gospel writer was Luke, and he had a reason, the best of reasons why he might draw such a picture. And he alone would record Gabriel's meeting with Zacharias, his subsequent appearance to Mary, her song of praise at the promise of a son, his nativity in Bethlehem, his presentation at the temple, his infancy in Nazareth, his meeting with the priests in Jerusalem, unique in all these details. And then Luke's gospel would weave into that the story of Hannah and Samuel. So why? Well, the answer is because they served to bring the purpose of his gospel to life. And every word and every phrase was overshadowed by the Spirit to that end. Now, let me just take you through that because, well, I think it's wonderful. Do you remember that the story of Hannah and her son was preceded by another barren woman and her child? Samson was marked out by God for a special role, and Manoah and his wife received an angelic visitation concerning the birth of the child. And despite her barrenness, the angel warned her to abstain from wine and strong drink in preparation for the birth of a son who would be, says the record in Judges 13, a Nazarite unto God from the womb. And from the moment of his birth, this child was set to begin a work that someone else would complete. So from childhood, Samson grew under the divine care until the Spirit of God moved him in the camp, as the record says in Judges chapter 13. And now come to the Gospel of Luke, and notice how the Gospel of Luke opens in Luke chapter 1 with these words, starting from verse 5. Luke 1 verse 5 says, "There was in the days of Herod, the king of Judea, a certain priest named Zacharias, and his wife's name was Elizabeth. And they," verse 6, "they were both righteous before God, walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord blameless. But," says verse 7, "they had no child because that Elizabeth was barren." So like Manoah's wife, Elizabeth, the wife of Zacharias, was barren. So this couple knew the same sadness as Manoah and his wife. But they were also to know the same joy because they received an angelic assurance of birth of their son, who would be called John, verse 13. And like the story of Samson, we're told later in the record, in verse 15, that abstention from wine and strong drink was commanded. But this time the restriction would lie upon the child rather than the mother. And like Samson, John was going to be a Nazarite from the womb, as it says here in verse 15 of Luke chapter 1, that he shall be filled with the Holy Spirit even from his mother's womb. So that spirit of Nazarite dedication, like Samson, couldn't be clearer. And like Samson, John's early childhood was overshadowed by God as he waxed strong in the Spirit, as Luke 1 verse 80 tells us. And like Samson, John would begin a work which would in fact be completed by another. So how marvelous that the story of Luke's gospel should begin with the story of a mother and a son who came before Mary and her son. So in John and his mother who preceded Jesus, we see again the story of Samson and his mother who came before Hannah and Samuel in the plan of God, a barren couple that came before Hannah and her son. And now consider Hannah herself in the matter of her prayer. We shan't turn it up, but you'll remember these words of Hannah's own prayer in the 1st of Samuel, chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. Hannah prayed and said, "My heart rejoiceth in Yahweh. Mine horn is exalted in Yahweh. My mouth is enlarged over mine enemies because I rejoice in thy salvation. There is none holy as Yahweh. And in those words, Hannah prayed so naturally and with such God-centered fervency and with words that echoed the language and expressions of the Bible she knew. And when we come to the record in Luke's Gospel, we're struck by the fact that Mary prayed with equal fervour and eloquence. And her prayer from the beginning was more than just the counterpart to Hannah's prayer. It was Hannah's prayer. She copied Hannah's prayer. She emulated and imitated Hannah's prayer phrase for phrase as Mary captured the spirit of the woman who'd prayed on the day that she loaned Samuel unto Yahweh. You see that there in Luke 1, verse 46, Mary said, "My soul doth magnify the Lord." That's Hannah's words in the 1st of Samuel 2, verse 1. "Mine horn is exalted in the Lord." In Luke 1, verse 47, Mary says, "My spirit hath rejoiced in God, my Saviour." But that's the words of Hannah in the 1st of Samuel chapter 2, verse 1. "My heart rejoiceth in Yahweh, for I rejoice in thy salvation." In Luke 1, verse 49, Mary says, "He that is mighty hath done great things, and holy is his name." But that's the thought of Hannah in the 1st of Samuel 2, verse 2, "For there is none holy as Yahweh." In Luke 1, verse 51, Mary says, "He hath showed strength with his arm, he hath scattered the proud in the imagination of their hearts." But that's the language of Hannah from the 1st of Samuel chapter 2, verses 3 and 10. "Talk no more so exceeding proudly, for the adversaries of Yahweh shall be broken in pieces." Mary says in Luke 1, verse 52, "He hath put down the mighty from their seats, and exalted them of low degree." But that's the language of Hannah again in the 1st of Samuel chapter 2, verse 4 and verse 7. "The bows of the mighty men are broken. Yahweh bringeth low and lifteth up." Mary says in Luke 1, verse 53, "He hath filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he hath sent empty away." But that's the words of Hannah in the 1st of Samuel chapter 2, verse 5. "They that were full have hired themselves out for bread, and they that were hungry ceased." You see, the whole of Mary's prayer was based upon Hannah's. She's presented by the Spirit as the Hannah of this New Testament story. And it wasn't just a parallel between Hannah and Mary. Hold your hand in Luke and come back, if you would, back to the 1st of Samuel chapter 1, and notice the particular degree and faithfulness that Elkanah himself had. We're told in the 1st of Samuel chapter 1, which is where our story began in our opening study, that this was the spirit of the man who was the head of this household. 1st of Samuel chapter 1, verse 3 says, "And this man went up out of his city from year to year to worship and to sacrifice unto Yahweh of hosts in Shiloh." So he went up. And if you come to verse 19, the record says that at the end of that journey, right at the end of the verse, well, no, halfway through the verse, "and they returned and came to their house to Ramah." So they went up, verse 3, up to Shiloh, and then back home again to Ramah. And likewise, they're going to come up again later on in the chapter, and then in chapter 2 and verse 11, the record's going to say, "And Elkanah," which did include Hannah with her, "went back to Ramah, to his house." And then they're going to come up again in verse 19 of the 1st of Samuel chapter 2 to bring the little coat from year to year at the yearly sacrifice. And then at the end of verse 20 it says, "And they went to their home." So you see, this was the standard of his household, up and return, up and return. It was faithful Elkanah who led his family on that journey every year. It was like a pattern of spiritual life. It was the rhythm of their yearly pilgrimage. And now look at the spirit of Joseph in Luke. Because in Luke chapter 2, we're told this concerning the father of Jesus, when it says in Luke 2, verses 41 and 42, it says, "Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover, and when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem after the custom of the feast. Now, when it says every year, verse 41, the margin says, why, see the 1st of Samuel, chapter 1, verse 3. Green's literal says they went up to Jerusalem year by year. Rotherham says yearly. And so just as Elkanah continued his visits despite a growing family in the 1st of Samuel chapter 2, so did Joseph, whose own household burgeoned to at least 7 children in the mercy of God, as we would understand from Mark 6, verse 33. So you see, here was Elkanah's faithfulness manifested in Joseph. And who were the chief opponents of this godly woman and her faithful husband? Well, why, Hophni and Phinehas, the opponents of Hannah and Elkanah, the corrupt leaders of a corrupt priesthood, the man of the clenched fist, famous for his aggressive deeds, the man of the brazen mouth, famous for his arrogant words. And the spirit of these men is going to turn up in the gospel record, hidden at first, but seen in the open when the Lord came to manhood. Now, let me show you how that starts. That story starts of hostility. Right here in Luke chapter 2, we read these words in verses 46 and 47. It says, came to pass that after 3 days they found the boy in the temple, sitting in the midst of the doctors, both hearing them and asking them questions, and all that heard him were astonished at his understanding and his answers. See, this boy asked questions of the doctors, the priests in the temple. And you know what? They were very, very good questions. And when it says in verse 47 that they were astonished, Rotherham's translates that word, they were beside themselves. And I think that in that term, we've got the first inklings of a beginning hostility. That this little boy in the temple asking them very good questions was already the beginnings of a threat to the priesthood, the first stirrings of one who might actually rise to supersede them. And now come to the end of the story, into Luke's encounter with that same spirit of their priesthood in his own day. Luke chapter 19 tells us this. Now we're at the end of the story of Luke, of our Lord's ministry. He's a grown man, and now that hostility is out into the open. And so the record says in Luke 19, verses 45 to 47, these words. It says, and he went into the temple and began to cast out them that sold therein and them that bought, saying unto them, it is written, my house is the house of prayer, but ye have made it a den of thieves. And he taught daily in the temple, but the chief priests and the scribes and the chief of the people sought to destroy him. So that unease, first exhibited against Christ when they encountered him in youth, has now developed into a murderous antagonism. And the stage is set now for a conflict that will echo all the way back to the 1st of Samuel, chapter 1 and 2. You see, what the Lord was condemning on this occasion in Luke 19 was the trading that went on in the temple courts. As verse 45 says, he went into the temple and began to cast out them that sold therein. Now that trading in verse 45, some of you will know, was actually operated by, surprise, surprise, the high priest's family. And it was known as the bazaars of the sons of Annas. And if you ever wanted to see the spirit of Hophni and Phinehas at work in the New Testament era, it was seen in the sons of Annas, of whom Josephus records these words. He writes concerning this family, as for the high priest Annas, he increased in glory every day, and this to a great degree. He also had servants who were very wicked, who joined themselves to the boldest sort of people and went to the threshing floor and took away the tithes by violence, and did not refrain from beating such as would not give those tithes to them. And so the other high priests, his sons, acted in like manner, as did his servants, without anyone being able to prohibit them. So here in the time of Christ was that same spirit of rapacious robbery as Hophni and Phinehas. The aggressive actions and the arrogant words of the sons of Belial would be seen again in the unrighteous priesthood of the sons of Annas. There's going to be an exact counterpart. Hophni and Phinehas are alive and well in the New Testament record, in the Gospel of Luke. But the father of these two boys, Eli, was not quite the same as his sons, was he? If you come back to the Samuel record, let me draw your attention to part of the spirit of Eli, which is notable in a positive sense. In the first of Samuel, just see how Eli is presented in the divine record for us here. We're told this, 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 9. So Hannah rose up after they'd eaten in Shiloh and after they'd drunk, and Eli, the priest, sat upon a seat by a post of the temple of the Lord. So here it is. You see, where's the first place that Eli is going to be found in this story? Well, he's an old man at the temple. And actually, whenever we come across Eli, that's where he is. He's at the temple. In chapter 2, verse 20, do you remember? It says that Eli blessed Elkanah, his wife. They went to their home because they'd come up to the temple. That's where they met Eli. That's where Eli had further interaction with them. And then came this night in Eli's life in chapter 3, 1 Samuel chapter 3, in verses 2 and 3. And it came to pass at that time, when Eli was laid down in his place and his eyes began to wax dim that he could not see, and ere the lamp of God went out in the temple of Yahweh where the ark of God was, and Samuel was laid down to sleep. So the story of the 1 of Samuel chapter 3 will also be set in the temple. And yet again, that's where we will find Eli. And we know what happened on that night. Verse 8. Yahweh called Samuel, again, the third time, and he arose and went to Eli and said, Here I am, for thou didst call me. And Eli perceived that Yahweh had called the child. And Eli, as high priest, was supposed to be the channel of divine communication. But on that night, Yahweh bypassed the old man and spoke directly with the child. And we know what happened, as we've already read, is that on the next day, on the next morning, Eli asked Samuel what was said, and Samuel told him every bit, every word. And Samuel, having told those things to Eli, Eli said, It is Yahweh. And you see, what we're being told in the 1 of Samuel chapter 3 is that on that morning, Eli recognized like a bolt out of the blue that Samuel was God's chosen one. And just as well, because Eli would die in the very next chapter. But before he did die, he was shown that Samuel had been raised up by God to be the faithful priest who would walk before his anointed. I think there was a blessing in that for Eli, don't you? He saw it now. You see, he saw it all. He was powerless to do anything about the dominance of his sons in corrupting the priesthood. But Samuel, in all his sweetness and in all his light, must have been a gift of joy to the old man. God would work through Samuel, and Eli knew that Yahweh's purpose would be continued through the boy. He would have been grateful for that. But isn't it interesting that when we come back to the Gospel of Luke, we find that Eli's recognition of Samuel in the temple as an old man will suddenly find its exact parable in the story of Christ. Luke 2, verse 25. Behold, there was a man in Jerusalem whose name was Simeon. The same man was just and devout, waiting for the consolation of Israel, and the Holy Spirit was upon him. And it was revealed unto him by the Holy Spirit that he should not see death before he had seen the Lord's Christ, the Lord's anointed. And he came by the Spirit into the temple. And when the parents brought in the child, Jesus, for to do after the custom of the law, then took he him up in his arms and blessed God and said, Lord, now lettest thy servant depart in peace according to thy word, for mine eyes have seen thy salvation. And Eli's striking recognition as an old man in the temple that Samuel was to be God's faithful priest was matched by Simeon. He likewise came into the temple, and it was there that he realized with the same flash of insight that Jesus was Yahweh's anointed one. And Simeon, like Eli, we believe was an old man at the time. In fact, the very words he used, verse 30, mine eyes have seen thy salvation, are an allusion to Jacob as an old man when he saw the face of Joseph. Genesis 46, verse 30, and Jacob said unto Joseph, now let me die, since I have seen thy face. An old man in the temple, recognizing Yahweh's chosen child. So Simeon's place in this New Testament story was the perfect image of Eli's place in the Old Testament story of Hannah and her child. He came into the temple at just the right moment to intercept the parents, to hold the child aloft, and to know that he was looking upon the Lord's anointed. Isn't that wonderful, brothers and sisters? Oh, and did you notice what the record goes on to say? Verse 33, Luke 2, and Joseph and his mother marveled at those things which were spoken of him, and Simeon blessed them. Simeon blessed who? Why, the father, Joseph, and the mother, Mary. But didn't Eli do precisely that when Samuel's parents came to the temple? 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 20, and Eli blessed Elkanah and his wife. So Simeon blessed the parents of Jesus, just as Eli had blessed the parents of Samuel when they came to the temple. And we also suggested in our previous study that there was a woman who lived at the sanctuary who, in the providence of God, was given the task of looking after little Samuel, Jephthah's daughter. And when her father dedicated her to perpetual service at the temple, she bewailed her virginity. Are we not going to come across her in this story in Luke? I think so. Luke 2, verse 36. And there was one Anna, a prophetess, the daughter of Phanuel of the tribe of Asher. She was of a great age. In fact, she was so old that the record goes on to say in verse 37, she was a widow of about 84 years. So Anna had been a wife for 7 years, but a widow for 84 years. So her widowhood was 12 times longer than her married state. And as a widow, she was effectively a virgin at the temple in her absolute devotion and attendance. Well, we do know that because that's what the verse goes on to say, verse 37. She departed not from the temple, but served God with fastings and prayers night and day. Now, it's been suggested that the phrase, which departed not from the temple, might mean that she was simply there for every evening and morning service. But I think it's just as likely that she did live there, and that such was her devotion to the things of the temple service that a small chamber had been found for her within the temple buildings. A woman resident at the sanctuary. And verse 38 says, Luke 2, and she coming in that instant gave thanks likewise unto the Lord and spoke of him to all that looked for redemption of Israel. She spoke of the child. This godly, spiritual, dedicated woman at the sanctuary knew about and believed in the destiny of the child she met at the sanctuary. Now, who does that remind you of? And did you notice the unusual expression, verse 36? It says, it talks about, at the end of the verse, from her virginity. Do you know that in all of Scripture, there are only 2 women of whom the express phrase, her virginity, is used? The daughter of Jephthah in Judges 11, verse 38, and the daughter of Phanuel here in Luke chapter 2, verse 36. And this woman's real name is Hannah. You see, everyone in the story of Samuel at Shiloh is going to be seen in the story of Jesus. Oh, there's one more part of the story, and that's the little boy himself. Come back to 1 Samuel just for one last time. In the 1 Samuel, let me just draw your attention to 3 beautiful expressions that are given concerning the development of Samuel at the temple. 1 Samuel chapter 2 verse 21 says, and Yahweh visited Hannah so that she conceived and bare 3 sons and 2 daughters. And here's the bit we want. And the child, Samuel, grew before Yahweh. And again verse 26, and the child, Samuel, grew on and was in favour with both with Yahweh and also with men. And now chapter 3 and verse 19. And Samuel grew, and Yahweh was with him. So here was a threefold account of Samuel's early life. He grew before Yahweh, he grew in favour with Yahweh, he grew and Yahweh was with him. So this is the lovely description that the Spirit gives us of the development of Hannah's son into the one who would become God's faithful priest. And now notice Luke's account of the Lord's infancy in details which only Luke will record. Here they are, Luke chapter 2, verse 40. And it says of Jesus in his infancy, and the child grew and waxed strong in spirit, filled with wisdom. And the grace of God, the Hannah of God, was upon him. And again, in verse 52, and Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favour with God and man. Now, where do those words come from, brothers and sisters, in the Gospel of Luke here? They come straight out of the story of the development of Samuel, do they not, in the Samuel record? Could there be a plainer parallel? Every detail of Hannah and her child will be transported into the account of Mary and her child. So why? Why does this record unfold in such a marvellous way in the Gospel of Luke? Well, here's the reason, brothers and sisters. You see, Luke is going to paint the portrait of Christ as the perfect priest. That's what his gospel's about. But he presents him as a priest according to a new order, a changed order, a different order than that of Aaron, since it was evident that our Lord sprang out of Judah. And that's why the Spirit overshadowed the writing of this gospel and wove into the account the story of Hannah's son, who arose as a faithful priest to supersede the Aaronic order of the day, rejected by God because of their spiritual wickedness. Samuel acted as a priest to replace Hophni and Phinehas, but his priesthood was based upon his Nazirite status, a different yet higher priesthood than the Aaronic order. And in this role, Samuel would prefigure the Lord, whose priesthood would also be of a different order. And I think this is why the tableau of Hannah and her family are seen in Luke's gospel and only in Luke. Could there have been a better Old Testament foreshadowing about the impending change of a priesthood to a new order, which Luke's gospel is about, than to include the story of Hannah and her son? Oh, and by the way, where's Peninnah in Luke chapter 2? And the answer is she's not seen there at all. She was never the real source of Hannah's adversity. And she wasn't the centre of Hannah's controversy. Hannah's controversy was with the priesthood at Shiloh, and every person crucial to that story is found in Luke's account. And the absence of any person like Peninnah to be found in Luke's gospel was the proof that she was not the focus of Hannah's grief and she was not the key to Hannah's purpose. So as we contemplate this journey, brothers and sisters, we see in Hannah a revelation of how the spirit of purpose in a person's life can enable them to accomplish things far above the scope of their normal capacity and far beyond the limits of their normal ability. How was Hannah able to do what she did? Well, I think we've got the answer in our titles, our title to the studies. You see, Hannah used a word which was the key to her spirit and the life of purpose that she lived. She said this: she vowed a vow and said, O Yahweh of hosts, if thou wilt indeed look on the affliction of thine handmaid, and remember me, and not forget thine handmaid, but will give unto thine handmaid a man-child, then I will give unto him, I will give him unto Yahweh all the days of his life. So the term that Hannah used to describe her own sense of purpose in life was that she sought to be God's handmaid. And I don't think that that was a word that simply indicated humility and submission. I think that that word captured the very spirit of Hannah's desire. She pleaded to be God's instrument, God's channel, God's medium, God's agency, God's means through which his purpose could be effected. Make me thine handmaid, she said, and she meant it. She wanted to be God's instrument. Now that's the secret of God manifestation. It means to be so committed to the divine purpose that we seek to be the very means of its expression, but to the honour of his name and not ourselves. And the glorious thing about Hannah, the thing that makes her so wonderful, is that she never thought for a moment about her own importance or rank. She gave herself completely to a cause that was greater than herself, but within which her own hope was realised. You see, when our spiritual objectives lie within the overarching purpose of God, all possibilities are there to grow into. And handmaid was the term that this woman used to describe that idea. So how do we nurture that sense of purpose in our lives? Well, Hannah did two things. 1 Samuel 1 verse 12, she prayed and prayed and prayed to God. She never stopped praying. 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 13, she spoke in her heart, because that's where she stored her meditations. And that's, I think, our purpose is sustained in our lives, prayer and meditation. Has it ever been otherwise? But you see, that spirit was understood by Mary, because if you come back to Luke chapter 1, and you'll know this, but it's so nice just to see it. We're told in Luke chapter 1 these words: when the angel speaks with her in Luke 1 verse 37, the angel said to Mary, for with God nothing shall be impossible. And Mary said, behold, the handmaid of the Lord, be it unto me according to thy word. So she used the same word. You see, Mary knew Hannah's story and she understood Hannah's spirit. They shared a common bond and they nourished it in the same way. Do you know how Mary nourished that sense of purpose in her life? Luke 2 verse 19. But Mary kept all these things and pondered them in her heart. That's where she stored it. That's where she nurtured it. And not just here, but again in verse 51. He went down and was subject unto them, but his mother, says Luke 2:51, kept all these sayings in her heart. Weymouth says she carefully treasured up all these incidents in her memory. Rotherham says she closely observed all these things in her heart. So you see, both Hannah and Mary became instruments for the divine purpose, and Yahweh worked through them because they believed in a purpose greater than their own. They believed in the purpose of their God. And now in this gospel, brothers and sisters, the faithful priest that Hannah yearned for had come. This was his moment. This was his gospel. And in the nativity chapters of Luke, I think the story of Hannah comes to its final conclusion because she would be seen in Mary, who shared her spirit and who revered her example. Luke revealed the life and times of a new and better priest, made possible in the birth of another firstborn son. Mary's first and Hannah's seventh. Mary's son and Hannah's Lord. And so we read the record and we rest content. Because when we see the woman of Ramah shining in the face of the woman of Nazareth, we know of a certainty that Hannah also was indeed blessed among women. And I think that for Hannah, the thought of being so identified with the work of God, that the privilege of being so honoured by God as to be his handmaid, it must have overwhelmed her, but it also lifted her to a sense of blessedness above and beyond the mundane. And I think that her story gives us hope that we might feel the same sense of reverence for the truth, and that we might satisfy the same sense of yearning to find fellowship with our God. And we will, brothers and sisters, we'll find both of those things when, like her, we surrender ourselves to being God's instruments. So as we leave this place, may we commit ourselves to her example by having minds that are always focused on higher things. And may the wonder of her life touch ours with its radiance. For hers was a spirit so rare as to be precious. In the words of a hymn, brothers and sisters, that perhaps captures the preciousness of this woman of God. Fill thou my life, O Lord my God, in every part with praise, that my whole being may proclaim thy being and thy ways. Fill every part of me with praise. Let all my being speak of thee and of thy love, O Lord, poor though I be and weak. So shall no part of day or night from sacredness be free, but all my life, in every step, be fellowship with thee.